and Crime Committee meeting. Our main item of business this morning is our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service. Please, will you make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode? Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Deputy Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Bailey, for whom Assembly Member Prince is substituting, Assembly Member Duval, for whom Assembly Member McCartney is substituting, and Assembly Member Rogers, for whom Assembly Member Garrett is substituting. We're also joined by Assembly Member Pigeon virtually.
Lovely, thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I wish to make a short statement at this stage of proceedings. Chair, I note that Assembly Member Bailey has sent his apologies for this meeting. Now, Chair, I don't do personal in politics, and I don't want to be seen to be unduly harsh on Assembly Member Bailey, who has already stepped down as chair of this committee. But there are issues of grave public importance that compel me to make the statement I now make. As you know, this committee, Chair, is focused on how we keep Londoners safe, all policing matters, and holding the Police and Crime Commissioner to account. Last week, my colleague Leonie Cooper wrote to Assembly Member Bailey seeking answers relating to allegations that he attended a party at Conservative headquarters organized by his campaign on the 14th of December 2020, whilst Tier 2 restrictions were in place. Yesterday evening, we were informed that Assembly Member Bailey was stepping down as chair of this committee. He did not give a clear indication as to why he was stepping down, but we have since seen in the Daily Mirror images of him attending the party in question, clearly in contravention of COVID rules. Nobody can underestimate the seriousness of this matter, nor the anger of constituents contacting us to demand the answers they deserve. Given the role of this committee in monitoring the Police and Crime Commissioner and the work of the police, it is surely unsuitable of someone who flagrantly broke the law at a time when many people were making sacrifices serving on the committee at all. Chair, therefore, speaking on behalf of my group, we say that Assemblymember Bailey should step down from the Police and Crime Committee with immediate effect. Thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to support the statement that Assemblymember Desai has made. I think if we think back to last year and compare this behaviour with the care and sacrifice that everyone was making, that behaviour just goes against the principles and standards of public life. Those principles of honesty and integrity. Assemblymember Bailey did not hold himself to account when he knew the full extent of what he did, and he may not have even told his colleagues the truth. This has a very serious impact on the Assembly's reputation, and I believe that it is Assemblymember Bailey's duty now to think about his position on this committee and also as an elected person in public life. Thank you.
Thank you, Assembly members. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you. I would totally echo my colleague's comments. I don't think the Assembly member should sit on the Police and Crime Committee given these very serious allegations, and I hope the police will investigate them further.
Okay, I will just say my colleagues and I were deeply disappointed when we saw that picture. To have a party last year was wrong, but he has done the right thing. He has stood down, which is the right thing to do, and nothing must detract from the very important work we have to do on this committee. This is an exceptionally important committee. We must hold the Mayor to account, and that's what we're here to do today. We're here looking at the draft police and crime plan, and we must get some answers from colleagues who are here today. So I'm going to proceed with this meeting now. Your comments noted. Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of November 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? Agreed. Thank you. Can we note the completed and ongoing actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, the question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime and the Metropolitan Police Service, with a particular focus today on the Mayor's draft police and crime plan for 2021 to 2025. So I'd like to welcome our guests who are joining us via Zoom. We're very pleased to see Kenny Bowie here, Director of Strategy and Policing Oversight for MOPAC. He is actually with us in the room today. And via Zoom, we are pleased to see Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, and Louisa Rolfe, OBE Assistant Commissioner for Met Operations for the MPS. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Right, I'm going to start, as is normal, with the questioning. So I think really I'll start with you, Sophie, if I may. How confident are you that the priorities in the Mayor's draft police and crime plan address current and evolving crime issues? And what evidence do you have to support this?
Thank you very much, and thank you for accommodating me joining virtually. I'm waiting for a PCR test to return, so it's the safest thing to do is not to attend. If I may, I think probably setting out some of the work that's gone into behind the development of the police and crime plan might be the best way of answering that question, Assemblymember Hall. There's been a huge amount of work in the run-up to publishing this document, not just in consulting our partners and making sure that we listen to what they feel is needed for London in the coming years, but also really putting together a very significant evidence base, looking at the facts and the evidence that we have as to what are the, what is happening in London in relation to crime and antisocial behaviour, and also what are the emerging issues. Some of those emerging issues were around, as you would expect, what is the impact of COVID? What has the impact of COVID been? And also the change in police demand. What have we seen over the last few years around changes in police demand around high crime, serious violence, domestic abuse, and the complexities of that serious crime as well as the hidden crime. Also looking at the evidence around what we know about changes in technology, the efficiency of justice. What do we know? This is not just the police and crime plan. It's really important to remember the and crime bit is not just about setting this priorities for the Metropolitan Police, but also looking right across the criminal justice system. What do we know around what we are faced with in the next couple of years? We know that there are absolutely very worrying court backlogs, reductions in the ability of the judiciary to be able to take the cases through. And also we know, and as you'd expect, we've had many discussions at Police and Crime Committee on this, what we know around the impact of some of the events over the last couple of years around public trust and confidence, issues around disproportionality, and then also going not just around COVID, but thinking about how has COVID exacerbated some of the issues we know drive crime and criminality around the economic challenges that are coming out of COVID, not just around offending, but around victimisation as well. So that's the work that has gone into developing the priorities in the police and crime plan. So because of that really significant amount of work, I feel, we're out to consultation at the moment, and we really do want to hear from you yourselves in the Police and Crime Committee, Londoners, and our stakeholders as to whether the priorities are right. But overarching, they are very, they're high-level strategic priorities. What lies underneath it will be, again, a matter for consultation and engagement. Okay. But I feel fairly, pretty confident as we've gone out to consultation that these are the right priorities.
Okay. Did you watch the PCC meeting on the 1st of December?
I didn't, I'm sorry. I've had some readout from it, but no, I didn't.
Some readout? Well, may I suggest you do watch that? Because I was quite staggered by the comments of the guests. Comments that it was a plan that could have been written years ago. The plan doesn't confront hard choices. Strategy doesn't reflect the scale of complexity. Can I respectfully suggest you watch that meeting and listen to the stakeholders, because they're stakeholders who really know what they're talking about, and I think the whole committee must have been quite shocked by the comments coming back. No doubt you'll hear some of those comments reflected back at you later, but
of course, I mean, as part of the consultation, of course, we will be looking at what people have said to your police and crime, to the committee, and I think you've been a little bit selective in the comments of the committee. I understand that The Inspector of Constabulary for the London region said that it's one of the better plans that he has seen nationally. So I think you're being a little bit selective. But of course, we expect through the consultation to have significant engagement and feedback from partners, stakeholders and Londoners. We are busy consulting Londoners, not just through our survey of Londoners, but also through putting on meetings and engagement with them. And we'll look at all that feedback to make sure that the final police and crime plan reflects that.
Yes, it was actually Matthew Parr, who I've got a great admiration for in the work that he does. He went on to say he feels it feels like a plan written 10 or 15 years ago. And most of those comments that I've repeated back to you, I've written down, they were from him. But if I go now to Kenny Bowie, did you watch the previous meeting?
I've seen it, yes.
You did? Oh, I'm really pleased you did, because some of the comments coming back were really very interesting. What hit you as one of the most significant things that came from it?
So I think the main thing for me was there's the debate about the level of granularity which people had. Some people were suggesting that we hadn't been detailed enough in what we were looking at, for example, around online, around hate crime, around modern slavery. And then there was, I mean, it's a really difficult balance to strike, if I'm honest with you. What level do you put something in at, where if you put in something in at a really, really granular level and you try and tick off every box as you go, then an event happens just months after you've published your police and crime plan, and it then looks out of date and it looks as if you're reacting and you've not had any foresight, versus the idea of trying to produce something which is a more strategic document where you know that some people are going to feel slightly aggrieved by the fact that it doesn't go into that level of detail, but you're setting out more of a direction of travel. Now, there's never any right or wrong answer to those things as far as I'm concerned. They're sort of two ends of a spectrum, and the aim is to try and get it somewhere in that sweet spot in the middle. We will be speaking to each of the people who I think they were already on our plans, people from Ben Kinsella Trust, people from all these other places, for us to go out and speak to as we do this. So hopefully we will be able to delve more into the detail of what was under some of their comments. We'll be able to explain in detail some more of our thinking, and that will be able to inform the final document.
That would be really helpful. Can I be a real pain? We're having problems with these microphones, and I've just been asked if you would bring yours nearer to your mouth when you're speaking, so that it helps with the broadcast. Thank you for that. I am very happy that you've seen that meeting, because I think a lot came out of it. If I ask, I'll go back to you, Sophie. What for you are the biggest risks and opportunities for policing in the capital today, and how are these addressed in the draft police and crime plan?
So going through, I mean, I've been through the evidence around what we are facing in London, and this is a continuation of the risks that we had. There hasn't been a huge, massive shift since May, since the election. But in terms of risks, clearly, since the last police and crime plan and this police and crime plan, the issue of trust and confidence has really risen as an issue. It was there before, but it is much more sharply defined. I think there is significant, and we've been very clear in the police and crime plan as one of the key priorities around trust and confidence, improving that trust and confidence in policing in the system. That is a risk. If we don't manage to collectively improve that trust and confidence, it will be, there will be a risk there for London and Londoners. I do think we've got very good plans in place to do that, but clearly we all have a job of work to do around that. Funding will always be a risk, and it always has been a risk throughout the last administration and this administration. Very pleased that we have got additional growth into the Metropolitan Police, but that's a 3-year growth. We had discussions last week, didn't we, around the budget proposals, whether or not we get the officers we have asked for. There is still a significant issue around funding. As London grows, there is a significant risk around, one, the review of the funding formula, and two, the National and International Capital Cities grant, which we still are £159 million underfunded. So that will remain a risk for London. And then I think one of the significant risks, which are also an opportunity, you've got to be really clear about this, is around technology. There's been such a change and a shift in the use of technology around criminality and the vulnerability as well of people using technology. So that is, I think, a significant risk that we really do need to make sure that we are sufficiently prepared for and sufficiently working with London, its businesses and its communities and its families to try to protect them.
Okay, the first thing that was mentioned at the meeting a couple of weeks ago was the whole digital situation. So I would implore you again to take the time out to watch that particular meeting. Kenny, do you have anything to add to that, as you have seen this
So I
meeting?
think digital, absolutely, it's both a risk and an opportunity. As Sophie said, I would add two things. I suppose call it a risk, call it a challenge. But as we emerge, well, if I suppose we emerge from the pandemic and we return to some form of new normal, I don't think it's really clear to anybody what that's actually going to do to the crime mix. Now, if people do end up working from home more frequently, what does that mean? Are we going to see a reduction in burglary? Are we going to see a reduction in theft? Or there's less people moving into the centre? What does that mean for other crime types? I mean, I think one of the challenges that we have at the moment in trying to draft this plan is that more than at any other time in history, there's probably the greatest deal of uncertainty as to what that crime mix and new crimes may be which come out from the pandemic. So I think that I would say is absolutely one of the things that we have had to really grapple with as we look at this. And if you look at, say, even 20 years ago, there was no online fraud, really. Now online fraud's, 44% of all crime nationally. So really, really difficult, and things, I guess, COVID will just change the nature of offending. The other risk, as I would see it, is to do with the entirety of the criminal justice system. And in fact, when you look at court backlogs, particularly Crown Court backlogs, in London, they have really, really grown over the course of the pandemic. I think at some point last year it was now up to over 16,000 cases. That is really considerable. When you look at the mix of crime in there, it's generally sexual violence and violence. So victim attrition, keeping victims engaged, how we care for victims and witnesses. I think all of those things are really big risks, which are clearly for the mayor and the deputy mayor to use their convening power, but equally where we need the partnership working with central government, with agencies like HMCTS and CPS, because this isn't something which can be solved by either us in the mayor's office or the Met Police themselves, albeit we have a sort of key role to play. And the other thing, I forgot to say over the pandemic, is if you look at what drives a lot of crime, there's quite good evidence that inequality is one of the areas which comes out in that. And actually, if you look at what's happened with universal credit rates up, I think 136% in London over the course of the pandemic, there must be a bit of a risk at least, or a substantial risk, I would posit, that inequality does rise and that has an impact on crime levels. As I said, I think there's quite a lot of uncertainty as to exactly what way, but I think those would be sort of two or three of the things I would pick out at this stage.
But there is uncertainty, but guests last time seemed absolutely confident that there should be far more about digital crime in the plan. So as we're concentrating today on the plan, do you accept that there should be more in that plan about the digital crime?
So that's one of the things in the plan where we specifically asked the question of people. Digital crime is a particular challenge for us as a sort of territorial police force, if I can put it that way, because what it tends to do is break the victim offender location triangle. A lot of that crime which begins online may actually take place in another force area, the perpetrator may be in another force area in England and Wales, maybe in another United Kingdom, they may be overseas. And actually the way in which you then work with the companies to identify those people and to bring about charges, or indeed if they're overseas in many cases, to bring about the causes of mutual legal assistance or extradition, and the challenges that's been brought about because of that, because of the exiting of the EU, it becomes a really challenging area. Do we think that there needs to be a greater focus and a greater sort of understanding of what's going on there? Yes, but that's one of the main questions that we've actually asked in the draft policing and crime plan, because we want to hear what people think about this, because it's just, quite frankly, a really, really difficult area.
I suspect most areas are difficult. I've got other colleagues that have indicated they're coming at the end. Did you specifically want to come in on this one point, just this one point, and then I'll have to bring you in at the end?
Thank you, Chairman. My question's quite simple, and once you've read the transcript, which I hope Sophie will read of the last meeting, I think the main point that comes out is what we really need is an executive summary that actually hits people between the eyes, the general public, Londoners, and then we can have a large, complex appendix with all the issues that those of us that are really interested in the detail of criminal justice and all the main public sector stakeholders. But what we need is a very short document to reassure Londoners that we're on top of crime and we know what we're doing, and then the detail will be in the appendix. Do you accept that would be one way of doing that?
I accept that's one way of doing it, but I would also accept that the way of presenting that information is a political decision for my deputy mayor and my mayor. It's for me to gather the evidence and provide advice to them. It's for them to make the decisions on that, would be my response to that sort of question to me.
Sophie?
Sorry, I didn't. In terms of the communication around the priorities of the plan, of course, we've got to make sure that the way in which we communicate that is really clear to Londoners, and how we do that. We will continue to do that in a number of different ways. Whether it is providing an executive summary of the police and crime plan, that's one way of doing it. We've also been really clear, we are constantly communicating what the mayoral priorities are around trust and confidence, around tackling violence, and around supporting victims. So we will continue to do that. But of course, we need to think really clearly and have a plan over the next 2-3 years as to how we communicate that most effectively.
Okay, thank you. I'll carry on with these questions, and quite a few colleagues want to come in afterwards. I think we'll ask you for a short answer to this, Sophie. As a result of the proposed priorities in the draft plan, what will MOPAC and the Met have to do less of? Because one of the things that came out in the meeting is that it wanted to be all things to all men, and clearly there is a resource issue, and therefore, what are you looking to do less of in order to prioritise what you think fit?
So I think one of the things we've tried to be clear about in the plan is Kenny's talked about it and I've talked about it on a number of occasions around the convening role. So some of what is in the plan around delivering some of the priorities is not just the responsibility or the duty of City Hall or the mayoralty, it's actually across the criminal justice system. So there is, we need to be really clear about making sure that our priorities are the priorities of our partners as well. And that's a lot, that's why we've done significant stakeholder consultation on this, and we will continue to do that through our own governance structures like the London Crime Reduction Board. Clearly, some of, I talked about risks around funding. Some of this will come down to what our capacity is, going forward in relation to resources, as to where on the sliding scale of things that we can do, what we can, the decisions that we can make. So, we are in the budget process at the moment, as you know. There may be some more difficult decisions to be done, but these are our priorities and the ones that we want to deliver on.
Okay, I mean, we've had suggestions that the draft plan is too long and complex. What's your response to that? And what assurances can you give us that you can achieve what you've set out there to do?
I think this is a perennial. I think Kenny's touched on it as well. This is a perennial issue, isn't it? If you produce a plan that's much shorter, it's not sufficiently detailed or sufficiently robust. If you produce a plan that's too long, it's too detailed. People can't understand. The accusation is people can't understand it. What we've tried to do is get the balance between making sure that we have sufficient detail in there to show where we, the key highlights of what we want to deliver, and make sure that the police and crime plan is outcome focused, so that we are, rather than specifically saying, a long list of things that these are A, B, C, D, down to Z of things that we're going to deliver. What we want to achieve are these outcomes around tackling violence and trust and confidence and, victim support. We will make sure that that happens. Alongside the police and crime plan, when we've finished consulting on it and we've absolutely finalised it, we will have underneath that delivery plans and really clear outcome measures and really clear issues and programmes that we will invest in to make sure that we deliver our priorities.
Okay, I mean, one of the comments from one of the people, he actually said, lots here that sits on the page but doesn't translate into reality. So they were somewhat sceptical about some of the things that are down there. We've also been told that much of the Mayor's current police and crime plan has been brought forward into the draft plan. Would you agree with that? And can you highlight what is new in this draft plan from the previous one?
So, as I've said already, you know, some of it, you can see within there are a lot of similarities, and they're, you know, moving from the previous administration, the previous police and crime plan. Clearly, there are similarities, and there are things, consistent themes in there. Of course, tackling violence is still the Mayor's #1 priority. That was a priority in the previous administration and the previous police and crime plan, and it continues to be a priority, as does victims. I think, as I've said already, you know, I've touched on already, I think significantly, trust and confidence has really increased in terms of its focus and its prioritisation in this police and crime plan compared to the last police and crime plan, and also the way in which this police and crime plan has been developed and the way in which we are making our commitments is very much more outcome focused rather than a long list of sort of inputs and outputs that we are committing ourselves to deliver. Doesn't mean we're not committing ourselves to deliver those outputs, but actually what I think Londoners want to know is what impact they will have, and we're really clear, and I think that is a significant difference from the previous police and crime plan, really clear what the outcomes are. We're consulting on the outcome measures at the moment, but they are in the police and crime plan.
So, listening to people so far, do you think there's anything likely to be added to the plan?
I hope we will get, you know, we've asked a specific question about online, and it's a discussion that I continue to have with MOPAC and with stakeholders around what is it that we can do. I hope through this consultation and engagement we will be able to really understand what, in terms of London, we can do on online safety and security and the safety of not just individuals, but businesses and cybersecurity. So I think that, I hope, you know, and the other thing that's coming back very strongly as part of the consultation is, whilst it is in the police and crime plan specifically as a driver of not just violence but acquisitive crime as well, more, you know, coming back quite strongly is to be much clearer around what is the position around drugs and how, you know, what we can do as London around tackling drugs, working with the Metropolitan Police and also working with our health partners around treatment. We've had the government's drug strategy published in the last couple of weeks. We clearly need to make sure that we're reflecting priorities within that into the police and crime plan as well.
Okay, I have got some questions for the Met, but I've got colleagues that want to come in specifically to the Deputy Mayor, so I'll take those first. Caroline Pidgeon, then Unmesh, then possibly Caroline Russell, and then Joe McCartney. Caroline Pidgeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. It's already been touched on, but we've had so much evidence of, right, one level people wanting so much detail and other people saying, how is the public supposed to understand this? And I really would push you to consider whether you need to have a kind of public-facing plan with the broad strategy and your key ambitions, and then the real detailed action plan behind that works for the Met, that works for the stakeholders. I'd really urge you to consider that as part of your deliberations on this plan. But my specific question is about how the public can respond to this plan, because after contact from constituents, my office made inquiries to MOPAC about whether there was a free post address for responses to the plan. Not everyone works online, and people need to have that opportunity to be able to respond for free. And MOPAC officers said they were not sure, given City Hall has moved and this may not be clarified until after the Christmas break. Given the consultation closes in January, can you urgently clarify if there is a free post address that we can give out to constituents, and what is that address, please?
I might have to hand over to Kenny around the details of this. I'm aware of this issue around the free post, and it's to do with the move from City Hall to Union Street and some ambiguity as to whether the free post address can be forwarded or not. But Kenny, can I ask you to come in here?
Mr. Bowie.
No, that's right. And if I can just begin by apologising to Assembly Member Pidgeon, because this is a mistake that I will take responsibility for. Basically, Sophie's right. This is to do with the move from City Hall and the fact that there was a free post address there, and we are as yet unclear and have not been able to get clarification as of yet as to from Royal Mail as to whether that is being forwarded to Union Street. I apologise for that. I believe that the officers have been back in touch with your office to say that we would be very happy if people are happy to provide their details to us, for us to speak to them directly and work with them in a way for them to get that in during this period. But again, I would just offer my apologies for that. That's an oversight on my behalf.
But if post is being, all our post is being forwarded from City Hall, I'm sure the free post can. I think it's an urgent matter for...
I agree. No, Caroline, we totally agree with you. And, you know, on the principle of it, it's certainly something we, you know, really clear about that, you know, you, as Londoners, you ought to be able to engage with the Mayor of London and MOPAC without having to be online. We've always been really clear about that. So we are urgently trying to address this. Caroline, on what you said around really do look at the issue around the comms around the you know, the finalised police and crime. Of course we will, because it's really, really important to us that Londoners understand that what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what we're going to do. We'll look at that, and I'm not a comms expert in any sense, and we'll definitely take advice as to what the best way of doing that, whether it is as I said, an executive summary. I'm very happy to look at.
Right, I think this has two purposes, this plan. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Good morning to the panel. My question is to the Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, I want to ask you a specific question about resources. In fact, we already talked earlier about significant issues over funding. So the Commissioner, the Mayor, and the Assembly all believe that the Metropolitan Police Service needs 6,000 of the 20,000 officers that the Prime Minister promised would be recruited by 2022. Would an increase in resources allow you to have a wider range of priorities, or would you keep these priorities even with increased resources?
Thanks a lot. I think the answer to that question is that increase in resources would enable some of the more difficult decisions and some of the difficult compromises that may need to happen not to have to take place. I think we would have the same priorities. More resources would enable, as I talked about earlier, a sliding scale of intervention, the sliding scale not just of enforcement but also intervention, because one of the things we've not yet talked about in the way that the police and crime plan is framed, it's very much framed in with a public health approach. So yes, of course, there is the role of policing, and more resources in policing is always going to be welcomed. But it's also about more resources around prevention, early intervention, perpetrators, probation, all the bits of the jigsaw that go to making London safer. So more resources. We're not just actually thinking about in terms of policing, but we would really like to see more resources being put into the boroughs and the important work that they do, into youth services, into mental health services, all those issues that really make a difference to why and where crime happens.
And sorry, one more question, Chair. Where are we with the campaign to get more resources in terms of the national and international capital city grant? For the benefit of the public, this is the money that the Met gets for carrying out much wider responsibilities, countering terrorism, protecting our iconic institutions, so on and so forth. So where exactly are we with this campaign?
So it's the National and International Capital Cities grant is something that we are always lobbying on, and as you know, in absolute tandem with the Metropolitan Police around this, because I mean, one of the things we haven't actually talked about as well is, the other strategic issue in London at the moment is the increase in protests, is the increase in an increase in protests and the increased burden that places on the Metropolitan Police, because we are London is the capital city. We're waiting for the police settlement. We're hoping it's going to be this week. We don't know what's going to be in it. We don't absolutely know when it's going to be. We'll wait and see if there's any additional resources for the National and International Capital City grant. I'm not going to hold my breath. It's £159 million underfunded. The last time there was any change how the government funded it was about £11 or £12 million, a drop in the ocean as compared to the burden being the capital city places on the Metropolitan Police.
I was going to ask you about the underfunding figure, but you already mentioned that. So, Chair, I'll finish on that note, just to say that the Home Office's own independent expert actually agrees that there is a case for the Met to be substantially sort of funded or get the appropriate resources to deal with the wider responsibilities that it has. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assemblymember Russell.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to go back to the question about what might we do less of. Sophie, you raised the issue of the government's new drugs plan, which very interestingly had a whole sort of public health approach wrapped up in policing around the outside of it. And I just wondered if you could say any more about that kind of balance in terms of the dealing with enforcement around drugs, around that relationship between public health and the enforcement side, and whether that, you know, the evidence in that plan that was published the other day gives you any steers in terms of things you might do less of and things you might do more of.
So there's always going to be a balance between, as always is with any of these areas, and through a public health approach, of how much is dependent on enforcement. And I clearly really think the Metropolitan Police has a very, very significant role to play in tackling drugs, from low-level drug dealing, and we have it within the police and crime plan around antisocial behaviour, which is often connected with low-level drug dealing in local areas, all the way up to working with the National Crime Agency and looking at how do we tackle the serious and organised gangs that are driving the drug trade in London, and then and working with international partners. And a significant risk that we haven't spoken about in relation to drugs is the ability of Britain to stop the flow of drugs into the country with the international instability that we're seeing at the moment with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's a real concern and a real risk that we will have more drugs coming into the country, because it is harder to control the flow of drugs into the country and harder to, with the instability that we're seeing internationally. In terms of I'm not being trying to, in terms of resources, I always think the more resources we have, the more we can focus and the more in-depth work that we can do, not just around enforcement, but also around, as I've talked about, tackling those issues and tackling the drivers of the crime, and also in tackling not just the who is who is creating the crime, but also where it is happening. So the more resources that we have, we can work with communities, we can do the intervention and prevention that's necessarily, and that's the same for drugs. We know that the issue of drugs, yes, of course, we need to be really tackling the dealers and the violence that comes with it, as well as the acquisitive crime, but we also need to make sure that we're working with those individuals who are addicted to drugs, who need substance misuse programs, and we've got to make sure that those are available quickly, they work, and those that need them can go into them.
Thank you. Assemblymember McCartney.
Yes, my question was to Sophie, really, and it was to pick up a bit of Caroline's point, because Matt Parr at the last meeting agreed with me that a plan that tries to be all things is really difficult. And he did say that it was one of the better plans he'd seen, and it was pretty close to the mark, were his exact words. But I think when you get groups in to give evidence, they're obviously concerned about their own particular interests, quite rightly. And so I think the point that Caroline made about having something underneath the plan that you can then point to for more detailed work is really valid. And I think a plan that is trying to set out priorities, and some of the criticisms we have that it was too long, but also that it was not long enough from some other people, and that it was not complex enough, and that it wasn't clear enough, were all at odds with each other. So I think you've got a really difficult balancing act in this plan. But I think the point about being able to point people to further action plans and further streams of work are going to be really important.
Can I just answer? Thank you very much. I mean, I agree. We've got to be able to make sure that that detail is there. And of course, that detail is there and is being developed. So, for example, on trust and confidence, we're not reinventing the wheel on trust and confidence in the work that we're doing. We have the Mayor's action plan, and we're very clear in the police and crime plan that the priority around trust and, part of the priority around trust and confidence will be delivered through the Mayor's action plan on trust and confidence. And of course, there's the operational action plans of the Metropolitan Police, around violence against women and girls. So we do have that, and then we have, specific issues around victims and rape. We have recommendations from the London Victims Commissioner published last week in a refresh of the review that she did in 2019 around what needs to happen. And of course, we will be responding to that, and there will be specific plans of action around that. So I absolutely agree, and I think in a large part, we've either got things in place or developing them, and that we'll continue to develop that as we move forward.
Thank you. Assembly Member Garrett.
Good morning. I'd like to, sort of on this question about priorities, and I'd like to pick up on the point that came up before about fraud, which I think, I understand there are 3 sentences in the whole police and crime plan that mention fraud. I think the evidence on the 1st of December was that something like 1/3 of all crime is fraud, and it's growing significantly. I think, Kenny, you said it was, did you say 44%? I think was the figure you gave just now. Yeah.
So I think that might be cyber-enabled crime.
Okay.
Crime, fraud and computer misuse, the new things which aren't the traditional CSEW figures. I think that's right. If I'm wrong, I'll write to you and correct that.
But at any rate, it's a significant area of crime with something like 1% of police resource allocated to it. I think Matthew Parr in December said that at least 1/3, if not slightly more, of all crime is fraud, but it's about 1% of policing, and some of it is trivial, but a lot of it is not, and you hear some absolute horror stories about the dreadful things that happen. And so my question really to the Deputy Mayor is whether there is, with just 3 sentences about fraud and that very low level of resourcing, is enough being done in this new plan to tackle fraud?
I think one of the issues that we've already touched on is around online security, and fraud is clearly a subset of that. It is, online safety and security is, yes, it's about harassment and it's about hate crime. However, it is also about fraud. So I think I'm not quite sure I accept your 3 sentences of just anything to do with fraud, because we're very clear and we've posed a specific question around online, and it's something that we will continue to work with the Metropolitan Police on. However, it's, as Kenny's talked about, fraud, again, is one of those issues, and doesn't mean we should be ducking away from it, but it's one of those much more tricky issues where a victim in London can be the offender, can be outside of London, not in the country. We need to work with our partners in the City of London, and we are working with our partners in the City of London. We regularly work with our partners on that, but it is absolutely something that we're very clear on in the police and crime plan around online safety, that we need to step up our response to it through the consultation and through the work that we're doing. We will be doing that. I also chair, it's not in the police and crime plan, it's one of those details. I also chair a meeting of the major, of the City of London, British Transport Police, to look at the threats in London, and one of those significant threats is fraud. So we have those discussions, and it's certainly some part of the delivery, the day-to-day delivery and the day-to-day work of MOPAC.
I mean, I understand how you're saying it's a difficult type of crime to track, particularly because it's non-geographic, but you've got something like 350 officers, or about 1% of officers dealing with it. Is that enough?
I will, in terms of fraud, those officers will be ones in the Metropolitan Police. Of course, we work closely with the City of London and with the National Crime Agency around fraud as well. And I will take in terms of prioritisation, it's across the piece. The Commissioner has to make those decisions around where and how many officers she puts in specific areas, and fraud is one of the areas of risk. Violence, in all its forms, is a priority and will continue to be a priority. So those operational decisions as to where those officers go is for the Commissioner.
And do you think there should be some acknowledgement in the plan of the links between fraud and other types of crime, either as a gateway crime for sort of new people entering the criminal world, and also links to either serious organised crime or funding terrorism? I think we've heard some evidence about that, where some of the people involved in this fraud are using it to fund other activities. Should there be more acknowledgement of that in the police crime plan?
Certainly we'll look at that. It's, in terms of whether there is enough of a link made in the police and crime plan, it's certainly a link that is made operationally. So it's not a question of putting it in the police and crime plan, so therefore the links will be made. I'm very happy to look at that as to whether that needs to be made clearer as to how this all is joined up by policing and by, across the country.
I mean, just finally, it seems to me that this type of crime that is significant and has probably grown rapidly, both in the scale of it and the sophistication of it. And I just wonder whether this is a good moment to do a major review of that and review both what's going on, how best to tackle it, and what are the right resources. And I wonder whether this new police and crime plan is a missed opportunity to have done that.
I don't think there's no opportunities that are missed through this police and crime plan. We have set out our priorities. We're very clear that online crime is a priority. We're asking specific question, and it's a work that is ongoing. I don't know if Kenny wants to come in here.
Yeah, thank you. So I actually think fraud is a problem which is going to have to be dealt with both nationally and internationally. That's why we have the City of London Police. That's why we have Action Fraud. That's why there's a National Victim Service which has been set up following successful piloting of the Fraud Victims Witness Scheme. I can't remember the exact name, which was run by MOPAC and the Met, and I would fully support any calls for the government to have a proper look at this and have a proper, give it proper consideration around what priority it should have. But I think any force, even one as large as the Metropolitan Police, doing something on their own here is going to have very limited impact. I mean, I don't know if Louisa agrees with that, but certainly my view is that this requires a national level intervention rather than anything done by territorial forces.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd just like to bring in Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe now. Thank you for patiently waiting, listening to us during all of that. One quick question for you. What is the biggest challenge for the Met in terms of the expectations set out in the draft plan and the Met's resource and ability to deliver it, all the while knowing that whilst you note the plan, you are not obliged to follow it?
Thank you, Chair. So in terms of the plan, the Met has of course been consulted and very much involved in supporting MOPAC's planning and work around the evidence base to develop the plan. We've had regular meetings with the team, and particularly Kenny and his team, and we've seen drafts of documents, so provided feedback, which for the most part has been incorporated in the plan. So we feel very much consulted and involved in the development of the plan. As you say, of course, we must have regard to the plan, but it is very much in line with our strategic priorities. The priority of reducing violence, which we've had some huge success with in recent years, in reducing knife crime, robbery and homicide overall. Of course, we are very concerned about youth homicide, and we're very determined at the moment to improve convictions for offences of violence against women and girls, and particularly rape and domestic abuse. And we share MOPAC's concern about backlogs in the criminal justice system. But in terms of the plan, we are pleased that it highlights the link between drugs, organised crime, the exploitation of children and young people, and the work that we've been doing to tackle both county lines but also child exploitation. So we are pleased to see that. We're pleased to see that it recognises the root causes and the complexity of crime and the role that many partners can play in helping us tackle crime. So prevention activity, supporting the work of the violence reduction units, that work also that local authorities, schools and community groups can undertake to help us in preventing crime and diverting young people from crime. So, and the plan also has good continuity around crime that we've been focused on for some time, around crimes that affect neighbourhoods like burglary, robbery, theft, antisocial behaviour. So anchoring the continuation of that work in our local BCUs, and also acknowledging the complex threats of things like terrorism. So, there are of course challenges for us at the moment, but our plans to rebuild trust, our plans to tackle violence against women and girls, and our strategy around race, inclusion and diversity absolutely, I think, reflected in the plan. So we're pleased to see that, because those are huge pieces of work for us at the moment. In terms of resourcing, so the Met, I think our challenge around resourcing at the moment, and I think you'll have seen, when we focus, and I think as the Deputy Mayor said, when we focus resources on particular priorities, like the development of the Violent Crime Task Force, we see some impressive results. I think, we are challenged around the skills and capability of our workforce. So whilst the National Police Uplift Programme is incredibly welcome to policing, and the Met has been successful in both increasing our numbers, but also bringing in greater diversity and more people that reflect the communities we serve. Many of those people have recently joined us, and they will take some time to build the skills that they need to deliver the best policing service to London. So we are very focused on building investigative skills, ensuring that people have good supervision and leadership so that they can deliver an excellent service to communities and victims of crime in particular.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's good to hear. I'm sure the rest of the committee agree that you're all on the same page on that, because that helps everybody. I'm glad you just mentioned trust and confidence, because clearly that's a major problem with the Met at the moment, and we must all look to see how we can assist with that. And of course, I'm pleased to hear that you are looking at the smaller crimes like burglary, robbery, antisocial behaviour, because actually those are the crimes that affect the majority of Londoners. So it's vital that that is looked at. We're now moving on to our second section, which is reducing and preventing violence, and it's going to be started off by my colleague, Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so my first question is for the Deputy Mayor and for MOPAC, actually, and which public and private sector bodies do MOPAC most need to work with in order to develop better policy, ensure consistency, share good practice, and invest in the most impactful programmes to prevent violence? Sophie, do you want to go first?
Yes, I'm not sure I'm going to give you a very satisfactory answer on that, because there isn't one particular body that is the key to this, because and I don't mean this in any way of trying to negate our responsibility, but as we all know, this is incredibly complex. So the complexity of the reasons people are driven to committing violence means that the partnership working that we have to undertake is complex. So we need, and we do in fact have very strong partnerships now, and we'll continue to build on that, working with the boroughs, working with health, education, and also working with our criminal justice partners around probation, incredibly important partner probation, to make sure that we can work with the perpetrators and try to, one, make sure that they aren't a risk to the community, and that's why we have, we've put in place things like GPS tagging, but also to work with them to make sure that there are the programmes to change the behaviour, and to really try to make sure that when somebody does go into custody, they come out and they are less likely to inflict violence rather than more likely to inflict violence. Mm-hmm. And of course, as part of the whole complexity of this is also the really incredibly important part of the partnership, which is Londoners, their communities and their families, and how do we work with them? And that's why the Violence Reduction Unit has been very clear that it is focused on working with young people, but very much being community-led, and that's why we have the My Ends programme and the work with communities around that. So it is a really complex piece of work. I want to make sure that through, and we are, these are strategic conversations at a London-wide level, that each of those statutory partners, like health, have a priority around violence, and that's incredibly important, so that locally, when local partnerships are working, when they are having those conversations, there are no barriers, that those priorities align, so that they are able to all align to make sure that they're tackling violence. And that does include tackling violence against women and girls as well, which is, again, the same, very similar types of partnerships and stakeholders in that, but again, making sure that especially with health, that is there. Now, the complexity, education is a particular issue, because there are, as we all know, it's very, very fragmented. Getting through to the individual schools was always a challenge, but it's something that we are working on through the Violence Reduction Unit and through the City Hall as well, and with support and the work also of the Deputy Mayor Joanne McCartney as well on young people and the work that's done there.
Thank you very much. Kenny, did you want to add anything on that question?
So I've just been jotting down. I suppose I've divided it up into 6 or 7 different areas. The first is working with the police, so the Met, British Transport Police, City of London Police, where Sophie chairs the Pan-London meeting, and we do try and bring it all together. As Sophie said at the outset, this is, people who have been on any of the consultations will know this is my sort of catchphrase, but this isn't the Metropolitan Police brackets and crime plan, this is the sort of London policing crime plan, so we do need to look the whole way across London. And I think in the Criminal Justice Service, we need to work with CPS, HMCTS, HMPPS, we need to look at some of the judiciary, we need to look at how listings and issues like that work, we need to work with MOJ and court backlogs, these are really quite fundamental. Then there's other statutory partners, such as schools, the NHS, others like that, who clearly, if you're looking at a preventative measure, councils, these are people who are absolutely fundamental to how we'll deliver this plan. And one of the cross-cutting themes, I think, in this plan, which goes out the heart of it, is the public health and partnership approach, and that will only work with them. Then within the GLA, how are we working with the wider GLA family, people like TFL, where you'll have seen some of the anti-sort of hate campaigns which have been going recently, but again, the GLA family, really, really useful. Then when you talk about businesses, I think there's different ways. A lot of crime obviously comes from the nighttime economy. So actually, a lot of the businesses there have signed up to the Women's Safety Charter. We have processes like Ask Angela, where it's really important. We're working with BART, which Sophie was involved, the Deputy Mayor, sorry, was involved in launching a few months, or relaunching a few months back at Ministry of Sound. We're actually working with the Security and Industry Authority for the people at doors, working with the bar staff, working with those bars and the sort of confederations that represent them. Equally on business fraud, working with bodies that we're going to be setting up with the Regional Cyber Resilience Centre to be able to give SMEs who wouldn't otherwise have access to advice on stuff like fraud and preventing that, really important. Then VCS, voluntary civil service organisations, a lot of them help out in terms of the victim services. A lot of them are more trusted than statutory partners, us, the Met, actually working with them to really get into Londoners or provide services on our behalf. Absolutely fundamentally important, I would say. And then finally, Londoners themselves, absolutely key. If you look at some of the stuff achieved through the Mayor's Action Plan, particularly around community-led training of new recruits into the Met on issues like stop and search, which we know are a really, really big issue for particularly black Londoners, young black Londoners, where trust and confidence is particularly low. I don't think it can be done without any of them. So I'm sorry that's quite a long answer, but they're the sort of 6 or 7 groups I think I've identified.
Yep. Thank you. It's reassuring to hear you both really emphasising the breadth of the partnerships that are needed to actually to tackle this. So has, I wonder if you can just give a few examples of how MOPAC has been successful in engaging particular communities across London to prevent and tackle violence, and any evidence that you have that supports that this is what we need more of.
So I think in terms of, I've given an example in terms of tackling violence and working with communities of the Violence Reduction Unit's My Ends programme, which is very much community-led in the 8 areas that the My Ends programme is in. It's early stages, but I've been down to visit Croydon, really, really significant piece of community work there. And just, I'm not saying it's always very difficult to prove a correlation between these links. Really fantastic work happening with the police around the My Ends programme, and we have seen an increase in, a small increase, but an increase in applicants of young black applicants into the Met in that area. This is what I'm being told by the when I go down to visit the My Ends programme in Croydon. So I think that's a really important element of it. The other part of the work that we're doing in terms of MOPAC in working with communities is very much around, it does link in, I know we're in the section around tackling violence, is very much around trust and confidence, and as Kenny's talked about, how we are working with communities and what we're doing to review the community engagement mechanisms to make sure that we are working with communities to improve that trust and confidence. Because the reason we're interested in trust and confidence is because it is only with the support and engagement of Londoners that the Metropolitan Police are going to be really successful. And we have seen success already in tackling crime and tackling violence, because we need, we need Londoners to work with the Met and to trust the Met and have confidence in the Met, not just to report, but also to engage in the criminal justice system, the way that their cases come to court, but also to give witness accounts and to give that intelligence that is so important for the Met.
Thank you. And can you set out which commitments in the draft plan will have the biggest impact in reducing violence affecting young people? Sophie, do you want to take that? And then Kenny, if you want to come in as well.
I think it's, I would have to have a look. I think it's always really difficult. It's going back to my previous answer, which is it is very difficult. We have a number of commitments within the plan and work and actions that we are undertaking, which will have an impact on the level of youth violence, and that is alongside the work of the Metropolitan Police. Which one of those has the biggest impact is something that our evidence and insight team will always be grappling with, and we're always trying to reach the conclusion of. Kenny, I don't know if you want to come in there.
So I think there's two ways of looking at that question. The first way is to say, over the medium to long term, what do we think will have the biggest impact in reducing violence affecting young people? And I would say our answer to that there is the work of the Violence Reduction Unit and the taking the public health approach, and them getting in with young people at a young age, making sure that they are diverted away from crime, that there is provision in place for them, and that the public health approach is given time to bed in. In the short term, what would I say? Well, I would say there is pretty strong evidence, and the Met is acting on this, around problem-orientated policing. If you look at the College of Policing stuff, that's been around. I think 1994 might have been the first evidence on this. And that's been there, and the Met are looking, and they've selected, I think it's 700 hotspots. Louisa will be able to give more detail than I can, I'm afraid, where they're looking at some randomised control trials around what impact that actually has on levels of violence. But there is, I think, from a sort of meta study that they did of 34 areas that had done this, it was shown to reduce crime in those areas by roughly a third. I think if that's not right, I'll clarify that afterwards. But I think that is the sort of thing which in the short term, an impact of that and really focusing on the evidence of what's known to work in those violence hotspots is the thing which can make the biggest difference, probably.
Mm-hmm. Neither of you have mentioned one issue which I've had conversations with many people about, which is the sharing of scary images of knives on social media. So Lgbtq, the Mayor, Patrick Green at a previous meeting of this committee from the Ben Kinsella Trust have, and also the whole of the London Assembly have agreed that the sharing of dangerous knife images on Metropolitan Police social media accounts is actually potentially harmful and potentially increases the likelihood that young people may decide to scale up the type of knives that they're carrying, or even start carrying a knife. And I just wondered if you were considering having anything about that issue in the final draft of the police and crime plan.
So I think the VRU have commissioned some evidence on that, which is due imminently, unless, Sophie, you know any more than I do. But I think it's due imminently, looking at precisely that question, Assemblymember Russell. And we will definitely be speaking to the Metropolitan Police about whatever that evidence says.
We had heard that the evidence was delayed for a while. So are you suggesting that you think it is, I mean, when you say imminent, do you mean within the next couple of weeks? Or
That, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Sophie, but that's certainly my understanding from the discussions we've had internally.
I hadn't heard that it was delayed. I was always expecting it round about now, but if it's been delayed, you're more up to date than I am on this one. I think also, Caroline, I think part of the, one of the things we haven't also spoken about today is the work that the Violence Reduction Unit is doing with MOPAC as well. around homicide reviews as to, well, where does the evidence take us, and what is it showing? I think it's a really important piece of work. There's been as well as the evidence gathering around the strategic needs assessment around London as well. But I think those homicide reviews are incredibly important, and I'm really pleased that within the police and crime, the police and crime and sentencing bill, that this is a provision that has been made, and that I really genuinely think is no small part from the lobbying that we have done from London to say we need these reviews to take place, because you're right. We always need to look at the evidence. It is very difficult to, pinpoint individual programmes and work out what exact impact there has been. But actually, that type of evidence gathering through homicide reviews is incredibly important. As we've seen through the domestic homicide reviews, it does make a difference. It can change practice, and it does need to happen.
Do you mean the offensive weapons homicide reviews that you've been piloting? Yes. No, absolutely. Very, very much strongly agree on that. So my next question, what action must the Met take to improve sanction detection rates for violent offenders? Who wants to take that?
I think I should send that. I think that's more appropriate for Louisa.
That should be to Louisa, please.
Yes, to Louisa.
Thank you. There's a huge amount of work ongoing at the moment around improving our sanction detection rates. We have seen some improvements, particularly where we're very focused on reducing violence around knife crime and gun possession, but also, we're very aware of the connection between, for example, things like county lines offending and youth violence and the threats to young people. So we've seen some significant results in that. But generally, in terms of criminal justice outcomes, there's a huge amount of focus at the moment in the Met on how we support every officer to effectively and professionally investigate offences, to support victims and keep them updated effectively, to gather evidence. We've made a significant investment in digital forensics, which will improve our response to violence against women and girls, where forensic evidence can be key, digital forensic evidence, but also often, as we've seen in youth violence offences, the use of social media, threats via social media, and capturing that evidence appropriately is really, really important. But I think going back to the previous conversation, for the Met, we would like to prevent these offences. Often by the time policing becomes involved, it feels like things are too late for young people. And for me, it's really important that when opportunities are identified by our officers to work with partners in the violence reduction units to prevent or intervene effectively, that we grasp every possible opportunity. So working with our custody units to ensure that we are making referrals appropriately, working with local authorities, because sadly a very small number of young people who come into our custody units involved in very serious violent offending, we find there are real difficulties in securing secure accommodation for them. Prison is not appropriate, but actually when we identify a very significant danger, it is really important that there is secure accommodation available. But going back to your key question about criminal justice outcomes, we're doing this through training our workforce, particularly our new officers and our detectives, ensuring that our supervisors and our leaders are very focused on the quality of investigations, ensuring that we support victims effectively, and working with the CPS. And as the current chair of the local London Criminal Justice Board, I meet very regularly with the two Chief Crown Prosecutors for London, where we talk about the quality of the case files that the Met submit for cases and violence. We have subgroups for things like domestic abuse and violence, where we're very focused on the quality of the work that we submit to the CPS and ensuring that we achieve justice for victims.
Thank you. It's a very clear answer. My final question is back to the Deputy Mayor and MOPAC. How will MOPAC and the Mayor's Violence Reduction Unit intensify their focus on understanding the relationship between drugs and violence in London? And can you outline any action that will be taken?
It's part of the links and the drivers of crime that we are very clear about in the police and crime plan. We a year ago commissioned a piece of work around what we ought to be doing, you know, in terms of City Hall and where the gaps were in terms of tackling drugs. We're really clear that we want the Met to continue actually stepping up its activities around dealing. There has been a huge increase in the number of people who have been arrested with possession with intent to supply, and then we've got to work across with our colleagues in health, as we've talked about before, around treatment services and also education around drugs. As part of this police and crime plan, we will develop more around the actions that we need to take around this.
Thank you. Did you want to add anything, Kenny? No. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Mayoral.
Thank you, Chair. It's a two-part question. My first is just to ask you that MOPAC and the MEC are providing further resources into neighbourhood policing, and that's something that we heard about from guests at the last meeting. And there's an extra 150 dedicated ward officers, which is really welcome. But would you agree that this plan could benefit from more explicitly setting out the role that community policing can play in gathering intelligence and in building community trust? Because obviously there's a read across in addressing violence and sexual violence and continuing to make sure that members of the public have faith and trust in reporting crimes to the police.
I'm sorry, just pausing because I'm just trying to think about what we have said about neighbourhood policing, because absolutely what you've just said then is something we totally agree with. I'm very happy to look at the police and crime plan and to make sure that we have made those links very clearly around the importance of neighbourhood policing in tackling crime and violence, but also the importance of neighbourhood policing in increasing trust and confidence. We know visibility is very important, but also the relationship between local officers and their communities. So the local officers that know their communities and are known by the communities is incredibly important. I will go back and have a look. I think we've been fairly clear, but I'm certainly happy to make sure that it is as clear as possible that we are, making that link. And Mark Rowley always used to say this in relation to terrorism, making that link around the system of policing, with absolutely neighbourhood policing being a bedrock as part of that system of policing, from all the way to violence to terrorism. We've got to make sure that neighbourhood that link is very, very clear.
Okay, thank you. Because I can, from the experience we've had so far of my BCUs, those extra police are really welcome. They do tend to be focused in high footfall areas and areas of nighttime economy and so on. And so the second part of my question is around and potentially the Assistant Commissioner might take a view on this as well. In those areas, there are some boroughs which there is a correlation between the levels of poverty and the levels of violent crime that are experienced by people. My particular concern is around those areas where the neighbourhood policing role is really, really integral, how those are deployed. And just by way of background, I'm sure others have expressed concerns here and will continue to do so around the fact that black boys are 6 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than their white counterparts. Just how we can maybe bring that a little bit more to the fore, the role of those neighbourhood police in building that relationship specifically. I think greater clarity or emphasis would be really welcomed by lots of Londoners, but I also take on board the point that those cuts to local authorities and the partners that you work with may have an impact on that. Just wondering how you might address that.
No, thanks a lot. I mean, the increase in neighbourhood policing, has been prioritised in 2 ways. One around town centres, the 500 police officers going into town centre teams, and that very much is around, that's been an operational policing decision as to where they go, based on demand, and also based on, the Cambridge Harm Index, to make sure that, you are looking at the areas that have the highest vulnerability as well, which, as you're absolutely right, and as the Mayor made a major speech about last week, we can see that link between communities where there is high deprivation and poverty, and the link between, vulnerability to crime and also victimisation as well. And then the second bit is the 150 additional officers into dedicated ward officers into wards. Not all wards in London, but again, based on demand and risk. So that link is very clear, and that's on top of, across the piece in London, the commitment that was delivered in the previous mayoralty around the 2 dedicated ward officers and 1 PCSO. I absolutely agree. Neighbourhood policing is absolutely integral. It is not the only part of the jigsaw, though, in the puzzle, though. We've got to be really clear that as part of the work, that we have the schools officers, really important in terms of developing the relationship between young people and the Metropolitan Police, and also the youth engagement officers who work in, in youth services and youth clubs and where young people are. They are also part of this work. But that doesn't mean to say also that wherever, and I know that this is the case, and this is how officers are tasked, so the violence suppression units, the violent crime task force, they are also tasked with community engagement and knowing their communities, because it's right across the piece in the Metropolitan Police that link between communities and officers is so important. Bedrock of neighbourhood policing, but every part of the Met has a role to play in this.
Okay, lovely. Can we pick up speed a little bit, colleagues, and be a little bit more concise if we can? If not, whilst it's very, very interesting, we will go on for ages. And now I'm going to go to Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you. My question is to the Deputy Mayor, and it's about violence against women and girls. The first question is that the draft plan states that you're also refreshing your VORG strategy. Are you carrying out any other specific consultation on the new VORG strategy? If you're not, how have you engaged with groups and organisations with regards to women and girls to make sure that they do feed their comments into this plan?
So we're doing two things aligned and in parallel at the moment. We've got the consultation on the police and crime plan, and the bit in, there is obviously a section within tackling violence around violence against women and girls. So that is very much picking up, as part of the consultation, picking up the feedback around that. We have also got a piece of, significant piece of work on consulting London and Londoners around the violence against women and girls strategy that we're refreshing at the moment. That's taking the form of, and I've been involved in some of them, but not all of them, stakeholder workshops. Claire Waxman, the London Victims Commissioner, is consulting with victims. Really important that survivor's voice and victim's voice is central to the work we do around violence against women and girls. And then we have the, as well as the police and crime plan consultation, we have the survey Talk London that also picks up issues around violence against women and girls. So we've got a number of aspects that we are consulting on in part of the refresh around the strategy.
Thank you. Can I also ask, are you confident that the plan addresses the scale and complexity that victims and survivors of violence against women and girls are facing? And has the recent concerns around the culture in police actually made that job harder?
There's two things. Yes, the damage that's been done to trust and confidence of women in policing has made it more difficult, and it means that there is a real job of work to be done, not just by ourselves but by the Met. And I know Louisa has been very much involved in this, in the development of the Met's own action plan around violence against women and girls. As part of the consultation, I've had many conversations around this. So it's an interesting question, am I confident? Because one of the things that's come back to me as part of this consultation from talking to IDFAs, the Independent Domestic Violence Advocates, and ISFAs as well, is that because of COVID, and I think we need to take stock of this and we need to think about this as part of our consultation and our response. I was really quite taken aback when I've been speaking to people around not just what they talk about, an increase in reporting, but actually what is happening to those women, that there's an increase in violence that has been undertaken in the incidents, and an increase in the complexity of the needs of the victims and survivors. So I think we really need to make sure and take stock in refreshing the violence against women and girls strategy, that we have really got confidence that we have really understand the complexity, what is driving it and why it's getting more violent.
Thank you. I mean, I recently met with Solace Women's Aid, and they were very complimentary about some of the work that was going on. And one of the concerns they had was regards to a lot of the wraparound support, particularly when women are trying to leave their partners. That often there is now more refuge accommodation, but actually the wraparound support, counselling, services for children, for example, are not there. And secondly, with regards to single women, for example, if they have multiple complex issues such as drinking, the standard refuge is not necessarily suitable for them, and there was a lack of that specialist support. Is that something that you're hearing, and what are you doing about it?
Yeah, it's when, you know, there's a couple of things I'd say in response to that. One is when we ourselves stepped in COVID to provide some emergency accommodation, and we were really clear that it couldn't just be accommodation, you had to have the wraparound services around it and the support around it. So we, you know, it's absolutely part of our strategic response to violence and when women do have to leave the home. We, as you'll know, the Domestic Abuse Bill gave a new responsibility to the GLA and to the Mayoralty around tier one authority, which we are, around refuge provision. We've been up to consultation on our draft strategy around that provision and our duties and responsibilities, and we're really clear within that it's not just about providing the accommodation, important though that is because it's a safe space, but actually what are the specialist services that are around that. And one of the key things that we talk about in the draft of the consultation, and we're just in the process of clearing it and getting it out, you know, the final version out, is that we've got to have services that are specialists, that are by and for the women who need them, but also that we pick up those issues around addiction, around and, you know, all the complexity of issues. I don't want to say everything comes down to funding, but one of the things that we are concerned about is that how you know, consistent is the funding in this area. One of the concerns of the sector is that the new responsibility around refuge provision may have an adverse impact on the response, you know, our duties, not legislative duties, to provide community support as well, because of the focus on the legislation is around accommodation. So we are really trying to make sure that as part of our strategy, we are looking right across the piece. And of course, the Mayor's been really clear in investment in violence against women and girls services, that we are investing in services, specialist services and services for women with no recourse to public funds, who are a significant factor in this, that they don't, it's very difficult for them to access the services they need.
Thank you, that's very helpful. I've got one final question, and that is, although, you know, the duty under the Domestic Abuse Act is welcome in many respects, one of the concerns is that it has separated it from a national strategy in violence against women and girls, which is creating lots of concern in the sector. Can I just check that the Mayor and yourself will be looking at domestic abuse as part of a violence against women and girls strategy and not separating it out as the government have done?
Oh, absolutely. It is part of our strategy around violence against women and girls, and I've had quite a few conversations with ministers around their decision to separate out domestic abuse from the violence against women and girls strategy. It's a decision that the sector have all lobbied and challenged, but it's a decision by the government that, you know, they have taken that decision. I don't think it's the right decision. We will continue to look at domestic abuse within the violence against women and girls strategy.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmad.
Thank you very much, Chair. And my question is both to Sophie and to Kenny. When will MOPAC's evidence base for what works in addressing the behaviour of hate crime offenders be compiled and completed? And at this moment, are there any obvious outcomes? Kenny, if you'd like to start.
So we're having a discussion in early January with our evidence and insights team about the future work programme, and this is one of the areas which will be on that. It's definitely something which we think we need to take a fresh look at. Is there anything obvious which will come out of that? I think if it was obvious, we wouldn't be doing a sort of refresh. So I'm going to say no, but if I go back and speak to my evidence and insights team and they tell me there is, I'll promise I'll come back to you.
Okay, thank you. Sophie, is there anything you'd like to add to that? I think you're muted, Sophie.
I don't think she wants to answer.
So I was trying not to get heavy breathing. No, I'm fine.
No, that's not a good look.
Thank you. And my second question to both of you. At the committee's last meeting, it was suggested that the draft plan does not reflect and that there should be a greater emphasis on the terror threat. Do you agree, or do you believe that the draft plan goes far enough to respond to these challenges posed by terrorism in London? Sophie, would you like to start?
I think we're really clear. I mean, as part of the tackling violence priority, we are really clear that not just around tackling hate crime, but terrorism is within there. I don't know who said that, but I think we are really clear around the priority around tackling terrorism, tackling and countering violent extremism. We've got very clear plans of work around that. As part of the Mayor's manifesto commitment, he said that he committed to commissioning another review of the preparedness of London to a terrorist attack. That has happened. Lord Harris is undertaking it. I'm expecting him to report very soon in the new year around that. So not only are we clear about the priority around this, we have taken very swift action post-election to make sure we deliver on our commitments on that. And we've also got the Shared Endeavour Fund, which is a significant amount of funding community programmes to work with communities and schools and groups around trying to tackle those reasons and trying to tackle the drivers of people becoming involved in violent extremism.
Thank you. And Kenny, do you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think this gets back to one of the debates we had at the start about some people want more of one thing, less of another, and vice versa. I would say on this, absolutely, there's three key things I would highlight. One is the Lord Harris review of preparedness, which will actually give us a really good evidence base of what has changed. And we know that the threat has just gone up to severe. We know that I think it was ex-AXO Neil Bassett who said that the pandemic had created a perfect storm of people being isolated and online. So I think that that's a really important thing. I think it's also really important to note the Mayoral investment into the CT Operations Centre, which is going to be, according to both MI5 and CT Policing, transformative in the way that they do the work, and that is a big investment of Mayoral money which he's put in. And then I think the third point I would bring out about the priority we have is the Deputy Mayor continues to chair the contest board across London, where we do bring together partners, hold people to account and try to drive actions. I think those are the main things. But again, I think this goes back to personal preferences of people, but I would absolutely not say that it's in any way deprioritised or not a priority.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just make this point because I think it's very important that perhaps an extract from the minutes of the last meeting about one of the panelists saying that there should be a greater emphasis on the terror threat. I think I know who said it, but without being absolutely certain, I don't name the panelist who said it. So perhaps an extract from the minutes can be sent to the Deputy Mayor and Mr. Bowie, because that reference was made to the fact that not enough emphasis is being put on the terror threat. But yes. I don't invite a comment at this
I do, actually. It was Hannah Baldock, Research Fellow within the Centre of Radicalisation and Terrorism. So there we go. Helpful as ever. Right, we're now going on to the third section, which is increasing trust and confidence, which you've already touched on before. And I'm going over to Assembly Member Mahima. Thank you.
Thanks again, Chair. So my question is both to the Deputy Mayor and the Assistant Commissioner. Given that just 56% of Black Londoners currently trust the Met, why isn't there an explicit target to increase confidence in the draft plan?
So we're very clear that that is an outcome that we want, is an increase in trust and confidence, and we're very clear about how we will measure that through the public attitude survey. So I think we are clear that, and in the Mayor's action plan, we're very clear that that is an outcome we want to we want to deliver by working with the Met and working with communities.
Okay.
So if I can just
Unless I've misunderstood the question,
if I can
sorry.
just add to that, if you look at the schematic at the back of the policing crime plan, one of the key things which we are measuring through the public attitude survey, and which we say we want to do, is to increase public confidence in the Metropolitan Police. We then say that we want to reduce disproportionality amongst all the protected characteristics to plus or minus 5%, but doing that whilst increasing overall confidence in the Met. So that again, this may go to the point made earlier by a different Assembly member about us needing to be a bit clearer, but it is in there. Again, it depends on your definition of whether it's explicit or not. But
No, sorry, can I I'm really sorry, I'm like a nagging person. Can you just make sure is nearer your mouth? These are...
Yeah, it's okay. Normally people can't understand me from accents.
No,
this is a welcome
it's not your
change
accent.
today,
You have
okay.
a lovely accent, but we can't hear you, and we want to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
So I take your point about the measurement, but I think there is the potential to miss an opportunity. So increasing trust and confidence is good and welcome, but I think one of the potential pitfalls of that particular approach should be that if trust and confidence does increase, which is good, that doesn't track a metric around particular groups of Londoners, in this particular example, Black Londoners, and I just wonder what you're going to do to make sure that that number increases, at least keeps pace with an overall increase.
So the specific metrics which we will produce on dashboards will actually track that, and it will show it very explicitly. What we're doing to improve that, obviously, we have started with the Mayor's Action Plan, where a lot of work has been done. A lot of work has been delivered, and I think we're now at a stage where what we really need to do is move from delivering the actions to move to making sure that they're having the impact and the effect that we desire on that. The other thing which we are doing at the moment and has kicked off is that we are overhauling the way in which we do community oversight of the Metropolitan Police, and because we know that actually it's word of mouth, it's the communities themselves and actually representative groups from those communities overseeing the Met, which can actually within those communities really drive impact. Equally, the Met has instituted its community-led training where they have people coming in and speaking to Metropolitan Police. It's not just about specific practices, but trying to make them sort of culturally competent around certain of the issues which come up, and that's not just to do with Black Londoners, obviously that's to do with the sort of diverse communities throughout London. So there is a lot of this underway, and if you look at online, we produce frequent updates on what is actually happening with the Mayor's Action Plan, and details updates alongside each of the actions.
Thank you. My next question then, the draft London plan highlights the Mayor's commitment to overhaul community monitoring structures made in November 2020. We've been told that a tender has been put out to investigate community engagement, which will report in July 2022. So my question is, why has it taken so long, and how is MOPAC supporting community monitoring groups such as Safer Neighbourhood Boards during this time of uncertainty?
Who would you like to answer that?
Kenny, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I can start and then Sophie can add. So the first thing to say is that the reason it has taken so long is that we went out to tender twice on this to deliver the specific work, and unfortunately we didn't get any bids of sufficient quality that would allow us to do this, and we think that this is work of such vital importance that we actually need to get the right people to do the work rather than just any people to do the work. So we've taken a very different approach to the commissioning that we have done this time for the wider groups, and that's the work which has been developed by our new Director of Commissioning and Partnerships, and it's much more about working with the communities and working with the groups that are going to be asked to work out exactly what is the right way of doing this, what do they want, how is this going to work. Now that's taken us a bit longer to work through, but we put out the invitation to quote, I think last month. We've had follow-up questions, and we are much more confident this time that we will have bids, probably in the form of consortia, which will actually allow us to address that separately. We have peeled off the work around community monitoring groups, which were obviously set up post the Lawrence inquiry, and have hitherto been sort of working independently of MOPAC. We have had various consultations thus far looking at that. We are just at the point of putting up advice to the Deputy Mayor about what we think the outcomes of those consultations have been. I'm not going to sort of go into the private policy advice we're providing to the Mayor on it, but needless to say, we think there is a case for change in the way that that happens, and that one of the options may be that MOPAC should play a more active and facilitative role in those groups, but I think definitely more representative groups, and definitely again it comes down to the flow of information between us, those groups, and the sort of Met in that triangle.
Okay, thank you. And then just finally on that, so it'd be interesting to understand what engagement and metrics will be in place until the point that the tender is awarded next year.
Do you mean in terms of what's happening with the community monitoring
Yes,
groups?
exactly.
So there are no metrics in place with them specifically because, as I said, at the moment they operate independently of MOPAC, but what we are trying to put in place and what actually the consultation process has led to is much closer working relationships with a number of them, and we're hoping that that is going to develop into sort of better flows of information between us and them and us in the interim. And even if we were to make changes, clearly that's not something which will happen overnight, so we are keen to, at the same time as looking to the future, improve the relationships in that interim period and make sure it works as effectively as possible.
Okay, thank you. And then my final question, Chair, to the Assistant Commissioner. Do you welcome the proposed move from setting annual local priorities to identifying and addressing local priorities as and when they arise? And what, in your opinion, are the key challenges of this approach for the Met, or opportunities, in fact, and how will it help the Met plan effectively?
Thank you. I'm a huge believer in local people being involved in policing, being vocal about the policing that they receive and getting involved and engaged in policing. So the setting of local priorities and ensuring that there is flexibility to adjust and amend those priorities when things change is obviously a very positive thing for us. And we would expect local officers to work closely with communities to build trust and to work together, but also to work to identify the problems that can't be solved by policing alone, and where we work with communities. In terms of course, it's helpful for us to be able to plan and to look ahead, but policing is an institution that prides itself on being able to deal with changing priorities. And if you look at our track record on policing through the pandemic and working closely with partners, I think you'll see that we've been incredibly responsive. And so I don't think that things might change in year will hold a lot of fear for us. But of course, we would expect, consultation and engagement with MOPAC if things were to be, constantly shifting and dramatically different. But my sense that, because this policing crime plan is based on research and consultation, and at the heart of it, we're both very focused on reducing violence and the sort of long-term intractable problems that affect our communities in London. I don't believe that we're going to be seeing things, flitting about day to day to very different priorities. My sense is that our communities, and often we find in our survey work with communities, that they're very focused on consistent concerns that affect them, and that we would want to work with them in addressing and reducing.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Very kind. This question is to the Deputy Mayor. Deputy Mayor, would you agree that in relations to increasing trust and confidence, that actually the SNBs, the Safe and Neighbourhood Boards within the boroughs, play an important role?
There's a number of factors around increasing trust and confidence in local policing and the Metropolitan Police. Safe and Neighbourhood Boards are one part of it, but we also know that actually when you look at the figures, its ability to know and to how to contact the police, making sure that the Londoners feel that they're being treated fairly, and also making sure that the police are there when Londoners need them. So there's a number of factors that feed into trust and confidence.
Would you agree that that MOPAC allocate funds to the SMBs on an annual basis for them to award monies to local organisations to help them to engage with the local communities? Is that the case?
So MOPAC awards funds are on a number of things. Yes, we have awarded funds to the Safe Neighbourhood Boards, and I probably can guess where this line of questioning is going, because we've seen a reduction, and from this year reduction in the amount that we have given to Safe Neighbourhood Boards, but we have also, alongside that, we've seen an increase in the amount of investment in community engagement to increase trust and confidence. One of the reasons that we've, it has reduced this year, and we've discussed that specifically with the chairs of the Safe Neighbourhood Boards, has been around the impact of COVID, but also around some of the underspends and underspending of money that has happened within the Safe Neighbourhood Boards. Overall, our investment in community engagement has increased.
Yeah, you've not quite hit the nail on the head, but you're getting warm. The situation, I believe, is that a number of projects have been agreed by MOPAC, and yet again this year there's been a failure to raise purchase orders, and indeed the last information that this committee was given when we last had our meeting was that no funds, although they are well overdue, have actually been given to the Safer Neighbourhood Boards. Can you comment on that?
I will look into this. I don't know the answer to this. I've had the issue of purchase orders raised with me a number. If I sound frustrated, I am, because this is an issue that has been a problem year after year. I will go back and find out what has happened, because we have allocated the money. It should, and if people have put the bids in and they are, appropriate and they have been cleared and all the things that need to happen, the money should flow. So I will go back and check on that for you.
I can maybe help with this, Sophie.
Thanks, Kenny.
Prince, just to say that yes, there was a delay. All 26 of the SNBs that have now successfully applied for funding have actually been advised now that we have set up the clearances for payments, so the submitted invoices should now be paid within the next sort of 10 days.
So you're giving a commitment, and I assume you will ensure this.
So I've lost you, Keith. I can't hear you.
His microphone keeps. There we go.
Okay.
Use that one, Keith.
Hello. Yes. So I have your assurance then, and Deputy Mayor, I'm sure you'll ensure that that happens, that within the next 10 days the SMBs will receive their purchase orders and the money will follow within the next 10 days. Is that what you're committing to?
Yes, I said that it should be within the next 10 days, and you have my assurance that we'll do everything possible to make that happen.
That would be a nice Christmas present for them, won't it? And can you also ensure that going forward next year, the payments and the purchase orders will be far more timely, please?
We've just taken steps within MOPAC to review our processes and our resourcing around this, because we recognise that this has been an issue. I am very hopeful and confident that will make a material difference going forward, yes.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. That would be good to get that sorted, as you've recognised, Sophie. That is a constant. It'd be nice for you if it was sorted out and we won't have to nag. Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. You've talked about confidence and trust with the Black and minority ethnic Londoners. We've talked earlier about violence against women and girls and that confidence. But just last week, we had the inquest jury into the horrific Port murders and found that the Met had failed to carry out basic checks, send evidence to be forensically examined, and the whole issue of professional curiosity. It was really a damning judgment. So how will this police and crime plan work to rebuild the trust of the LGBTQ plus community after they will feel they've been so badly failed by the Met Police? And perhaps also, that's for you, Sophie, and then Louisa, whether you could just give a brief outline of what immediate actions the force are going to take in this area, please.
Thanks, Caroline. The Mayor's really been clear about this and put out a statement at on Friday after the inquest, and obviously we've been following this and really concerning the evidence that came out not just during the murder trial but during the inquest as well, around failures in the investigation. Really clear. I hope you will have seen that I've written to HMIC, and they will be coming in sometime in the new year, depending on capacity, and we've got to work that through in terms of timing, to have a look as to the significant changes that the Met have put in place in terms of investigation, as to the impact of those, so that we can get assurances, so I can get assurances, but also Londoners can get assurances about the ability of the Met to investigate. And then there's the issue around the culture of the Met. Now, the inquest and the coroner were very clear that they didn't look at homophobia within that, but I know that that has been, you know, there is an issue around the trust and confidence in the LGBTQ plus community. I'm clear that Baroness Casey's review into the culture of the Met should be looking at all aspects of culture, and that is a significant piece of work, and that is part of the detailed actions that flow from the police and crime plan around increasing trust and confidence, and that really has to be around ensuring that the culture of the Met is appropriate and that there are, you know, that we'll wait and see where Baroness Casey goes and her recommendations, but I think that's a significant piece of work that flows from, you know, commissioned by the Commissioner, but a piece of work that flows from the police and crime plan.
Thank you. Louisa?
Thank you. You will have seen Assistant Commissioner Helen Ball's statement in the media last week, and just to reiterate that the families of those young men rightly expected a professional and thorough investigations by the police into the death of their loved ones, and they didn't get that. And for that, we are truly, truly sorry. You'll be aware that, of course, the inquest came at the end of a significant period of time, and we haven't waited to make significant changes. From, of course, there was learning at a very early stage about what had gone wrong in those investigations, and the Met has worked incredibly hard to address that. But also, as the Deputy Mayor says, these things are, you know, it's the work that we're doing on our strategy to address inclusion, diversity, the work that we're doing to improve our response to violence against women and girls, and our very clear action plan to rebuild trust are all inextricably linked. And I'm working really closely with Helen Ball, who leads our STRIVE strategy, Rachel Williams, who's leading our Rebuilding Trust work, to make sure that those plans complement each other, they fit together seamlessly, and that we build on them to really focus on improving the trust and confidence in our approach, but also that we are incredibly focused at the moment in improving investigations. So much has happened since 2015 to ensure that the investigations of unexplained or sudden deaths have a very professional approach, that they're appropriately overseen by people who are skilled and competent, and that leaders are really focused on the things that we've learned from these cases. So, and we see every day through our reviews that work is continuing to improve, but at the moment our focus is on, you know, being really open and transparent about what went wrong, how sorry we are, but also working incredibly hard to improve that trust. And we have, you know, in November we shared our initial action plan to address violence against women and girls. The Rebuilding Trust plan will be published imminently. Please do have a look at those documents, provide us some feedback. We've committed to further consultation on the Violence Against Women and Girls Action Plan. I'm meeting with specialists from the sector, but also please, any feedback you can give us on all of this work, we really appreciate it, because it's something that, you know, we're being incredibly introspective at the moment. Really welcome the start of the work with Baroness Casey, that will give us more to do, I'm sure, and you know, please be assured of our commitment to take on board the learning and ensure that you see tangible improvements, both in our approach, but also in the confidence that Londoners have in our work.
Thank you. Yes, just our committee, the community as a whole, very clearly are very concerned. Can I just ask Deputy Mayor, just on this wider issue of confidence, given your own data shows confidence in the police has fallen consistently over the last 4 years. It was 69% in 2017, just 54% June this year. Is enough set out in this draft plan in terms of measures and actions? Is it the change of direction and focus that's needed and clearly needed to improve public trust and confidence, given we've had, you know, really big issue after big issue? I mean, I have to say I wouldn't want to be in the Metropolitan Police at the moment, dealing with such challenges and such things that damage the, you know, the public's confidence and trust in them.
I do think we're very clear in this plan. It's a significant priority, you know, it's one of the 4 priorities around trust and confidence. And we're very clear that this is trust and confidence across the piece, not just with Black communities, but with women and LGBT plus. We know there's an issue with disabled Londoners as well around trust and confidence. I do think we are clear. Of course, we're consulting, and if we get feedback that we aren't clear enough, and we need to take specific measures, we will do that because it is an absolute priority. And I think we're also very clear about what the outcomes are that we are expecting to achieve, how we will measure it through the public attitude survey, and we have significant pieces of work, not just from City Hall, but also within the Metropolitan Police on how how we hope to deliver it. However, we are consulting, and it goes back probably to the conversation we had at the beginning of this committee around, do we need some more comms around, comms that Londoners can hear around the overarching highlights in the strategy. I'll look at that because we've got a significant amount of work in here, and I'm really keen that Londoners not appreciate, that sounds wrong, that's the wrong word, are able to understand what we're doing and to feedback and to challenge what we're doing if they don't think it's enough. And part of that process is this police and crime plan consultation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm mindful of the time. I'll make 3 comments and I think the committee will write to you. The first comment is thank you, Assemblymember Pigeon, for bringing up that particular case. The LGBT community must be very, very concerned. A horrific case. I'm also not happy with the response you gave to Assemblymember Moima regarding the first question. Given that just 56% of Black Londoners currently trust the Met, we must deal with that. It really has got to be looked into. And the other thing is this low harm, high volume crimes. It was brought up a lot at the last meeting. The most interaction the public, Londoners, have with the police are these low harm, high volume crimes. And until that interaction with the police becomes a good one, i.e. these things are resolved, then I don't believe that trust and confidence will come back. Falling sanction detection rates since 2016 are a real issue. I'm mindful of the time. I'll proceed, but we will write to you regarding that because the Met needs to have trust and confidence before it can achieve anything, in my view. I'm taking us through the next set of questions, and it's better supporting victims. So I'll ask you all to be concise, please. How will the final police and crime plan incorporate the findings and recommendations of the Victims' Strategic Needs Assessment for London? I'll ask, let me ask Kenny for a change. Kenny, nice and close to the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair. So we now have the Victim Strategic Needs Assessment. So we are currently working our way through that, looking at what that means for the policing crime plan. And I mean, the short answer is once we have assessed that, we will incorporate that into the policing crime plan in the same way that we will incorporate some of the findings from the independent London Victims Commissioner that she's just produced on the London rape review, and that will also inform the work which is being done to fulfil the Mayor's manifesto commitment, looking at what may or may not be needed around, or the feasibility of a victims care hub, which is being jointly led by MOPAC and the Met, with the working group to look at that, chaired by Assistant Commissioner Rolfe and our Director of Commissioning and Partnership. So the short answer is, I'm afraid it's sort of TBC, but we now have it and are working our way through it.
Okay, and when will the business case for the Victim Care Hub be completed? And what are your basic key asks and intended outcomes for the hub be?
So exactly when that will be completed, well, first of all, it's a feasibility study, so we're at the strategic business case stage rather than a full outline business case or a full business case. So it slightly depends on exactly what you mean by business case, but we're hoping in conjunction with PA Consulting that there will be something within the next few months that the Deputy Mayor and the Mayor can look at. The Deputy Mayor has been briefed on what has been happening so far. She's asked that a little bit more work goes back on it, and we're just working through the sort of exactly how long that will take and the level of detail that is needed.
So we're looking at a couple of months, do you think?
I think that's a
fair
estimate, but I'm kind of
so
loath to put a specific thing, but I think that's a fair estimate, yeah.
Well, that's good. And a nod from the Deputy Mayor is always a good thing. So how many additional IDFAs and ISFAs will be funded during the life of the new police and crime plan? Sophie, I better ask you that one.
And I'm sorry, I'm going to give you an unsatisfactory answer to that. It will depend on the funding. A lot of the funding for the ITVAs and ISVAs comes from the Ministry of Justice grant. We haven't yet had clarity on what that will be for next year. It will also depend on whether it will be a 3-year allocation. We know that actually the Ministry of Justice got a fairly good outcome from the spending review. What we don't know, I think it's about £40 million into victim services. What we don't know is what the allocation for London is going to be. The Mayor has made a commitment in the manifesto to increase the number of ITVAs and ISVAs, so we will not only lobby, but we will also be looking at our own budgets as to what we can do to make sure the incredibly important role of ITVAs and ISVAs is supported and continued in London. Not continued, but added to in London.
Yeah, I know, they absolutely are, and we're always talking about them, and that needs to be looked at. I'm sure we'll come back to that, colleagues, at another time. And what new innovation has the Met and MOPAC considered in order to support young victims?
Well, I think the significant piece of work that you just asked about around the victim care hub is very, very important in supporting victims. But sorry, were you particularly asking about young victims?
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things around young victims. The Violence Reduction Unit has invested in a programme of work around young victims of domestic abuse and what they might need and how that can be developed. And we also have we invest in a Children and Young People's Victim Service, where the work of the Violence Reduction Unit will feed into, and the Victims Needs Assessment will also feed into, to make sure that when we re-procure that Children and Young People's Service, we are looking at what works, what is needed to work within the community, and have a proper feedback from young victims in London. So that's a piece of work that is underway.
Oh, that's good. I mean, obviously victims want justice, but during the recent PCC meeting, Judith Banjoko, who was from the Solace Women's Aid, spoke about the low level of prosecution levels of rape. Do you expect by the end of this plan there'll be a significant uplift in the sanction detection rates for this particular crime? Sophie?
I don't need to tell you. I mean, Claire published the report, the London Victims Commissioner published a report last week. It's down to 1%. I mean, it is shocking. And I know Louisa is absolutely committed to this and is very much on top of this. We have worked nationally with the Home Office around Operation Bluestone and Operation Soteria, and MOPAC has invested in this, which is a really significant piece of work. Deep dive in Avon and Somerset, deep dive in the Metropolitan Police is just concluding at the moment into how do we absolutely get a step change in the number of times that people are prosecuted for rape, men are prosecuted for rape, because at the moment it is too low. It is about victim support, but it is also around investigation processes, and that deep dive is a significant piece of work. So I am optimistic that during the course of this police and crime plan that we will begin to see a real improvement in detection rates for rape.
I really hope so. It's shockingly low. We're agreed on that. I'll take us now to Assembly Member McCartney to finish off on this section. You've finished. That's jolly good. Okay, we're now moving, colleagues, to protecting people from being exploited or harmed, and this is going to be led by Assembly Member Pidgeon.
Lovely, thank you very much. In the plan, you talk about wanting to ensure young people in the justice system are safe and supported, but measuring that progress is going to be difficult. You're going to use qualitative data. So how are you going to harness the voices of adults and children in that justice system?
I think I might hand over to Kenny on this one.
Thanks. So there's various different ways.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So there's various ways that we can do that. The sort of simplest way, if you like, is in terms of the victims. We have the user satisfaction survey. We have the public attitudes survey, both of which provide free text examples for us to be able to, and those are both 16 plus rather than children, but to be able to understand what's going on. We have our sort of, I think it's or triannual youth survey going on at the moment, which specifically asks about young people's experiences of the police and the criminal justice service. We have programmes like Lighthouse, where we obviously do know what's going on. We have evaluations which we produce. We have academic research which comes out. We have survivor communities which are led by either us or Claire Waxman, both in terms of children and young people. We have interaction with councils, safeguarding people, and we also have reports from HMIC, FRS and other inspectorate bodies. So that's what we meant by qualitative. It's a really difficult one. The reason, and we'll always take a quantitative and a qualitative to the other areas as well, but this is one area in particular where we felt that providing particularly quantitative targets could really skew stuff in a particular direction. We wanted to avoid that, except that makes it more difficult to concretely demonstrate progress. But I think this is the slightly more sophisticated, albeit more difficult, but the right way to go about looking at this sort of stuff.
Okay, thank you. So you're sort of developing that up, and we might get some more detail on that, presumably in due course, once you've...
Yeah, very happy to write with more detail on exactly what we mean by that, if you like. And
then in the plan, you talk about a child-first approach. What does that mean in practice for the Met and MOPAC? And can you give an example of what would be different under this approach?
So I'll let Louisa speak for the Met, but in terms of what we mean, it's when you actually look at when a child comes into contact, whether that with the criminal justice system or any of the associated provisions which we provide, it's not looking at what is best for that system in terms of how you proceed with the child, but taking a much more holistic view of what is in the child's best interests and then approaching it that way. So if you were to pick up, I don't know, some of the examples during the public consultation has been stuff around sexting, or like when children are maybe very, very young, they're maybe 10 or 11 and doing that. And okay, they may technically have committed an offence, but do they really understand what they've been doing? Have they really had the education that they need? So rather than immediately going down a criminal justice outcome, is there a better sort of education or different approach which can be taken to avoid giving them a sort of criminal record for a large chunk of their life? So that's what a child first approach means. It means looking at the child through what their actual life is and what it's going to mean for them, rather than looking at them as a cog in an individual system which sort of depersonalises and dehumanises them.
And of course, many of these children may well be victims as well as perpetrators, as it were, and it's looking, I mean, Louisa, I don't know if you want to comment on this, but how are you going to ensure that this new approach is really embedded? Because if you look at the HMI reports, which we have seen, have been really quite damning over several years in this area of child protection and working with children, with quotes from officers which show they don't understand that child-centred approach. So how can I be confident that the Met has changed and is going to deliver on this? And Sophie, perhaps you could then comment how you can be confident that the Met is going to deliver on this.
Thank you. So a number of things are underway. So we've increased advanced training within our custody suite so that our custody staff recognise the specific needs of vulnerable children. And even down to the detail of when young people are brought into custody, you know, our standard offer, often the sort of, you know, well-being bit is around, would you like a tea, a coffee, a hot meal? Actually, young people don't like tea and coffee generally. So offering squash and biscuits and things that ensuring that there is the right support, appropriate adults to support people, and better information for parents when young people come into our custody suite is one thing we're doing. We've initiated a multi-agency review of how we share information with partners in terms of the response to children who are identified as at risk. And the best example I can give of a child-centred approach is, you know, there's some very good practice in policing nationally around the way that we deal with, for example, very serious offences of child sexual abuse, where often our approach is, you know, the system that the way that we would collect evidence from adult victims, you know, that won't work for young people. They're sort of there, you know, sending people for a forensic examination, a medical examination, and then a long and intensive video interview. So there's really good advanced practice that's been around for years, that's often led by community paediatricians who would guide both police investigators but also social workers in the way that they interact with a child and the best way of obtaining evidence. And much of that, can be expanded to other types of crime to ensure that we're focused on the needs of children. So we're looking at how we do that, but also we've increased our resources working in our online child sexual abuse and exploitation teams to ensure that increasing local resources as well as the central team, working really hard, as Kenny's described, around not unnecessarily criminalising young people and focusing on how we work with schools and social care teams around preventing offences, but responding appropriately to offences like sexting that don't unnecessarily criminalise, and focus on how we might work with young people to raise their understanding, prevent offending in the first place. The recommendations specifically from HMIC around immediate action were around governance and oversight of child protection practices, improving the response to young people who go missing from home, improving understanding and awareness of risk to children, and then improving the management of people posing a risk to children. We have made significant strides on all of those areas. There's been a lot of work underway, ensuring that resources are better managed to meet the demands of child protection cases, and with children's social care, the practices around detained children, and auditing the skills and experience of our staff involved in those safeguarding investigations. And with our professional lead, Commander Mel Dales, we have a very detailed public protection plan that covers not only child protection, but a lot of other areas around public protection, like domestic abuse and rape investigations, that reports very frequently into meetings chaired by Nick Fgrave, one of my colleagues who leads frontline policing. So there's a lot of governance and oversight. There's both tracking improvement activity, but looking at the outcomes from this work too.
Thank you. And Sophie, just how are you assuring yourself, because we've talked about this many times over many years,
we have.
Actually, this is a key change in your plan. So how are you going to assure yourself this is being delivered? Louisa describes a very good active picture, but on the ground it can be very different.
There's a few ways. Obviously, we've got a key role, you're right, in oversight. As you know, I've been chairing the Child Protection Oversight Group. I've actually got a meeting with that this week, and the voice of the child was one of the HMIC recommendations right at the beginning, and one that we haven't, we do keep focusing on. So that important role of oversight, we need to work through with the police, with Kenny and his directorate, around what does that oversight structure and framework look like going forward, to make sure that we are able to continue that focus on children, but also pick up all the other elements that, make sure that we've got the right level of focus around. In particular, the other area that we assure ourselves that child first approach happens is by some of the investment that we actually undertake. Because one of the things around the way that child first should be delivered is taking into consideration the needs of the child. So, for example, youth workers in accident emergency units, London Gang Exit, all those programs of investments that either ourselves and MOPAC or the Violence Reduction Unit invest in, really do think about the needs of the child. And the other area that I would just point to just briefly, because I know Chair's been very mindful of time, is that we have a role in safeguarding, and MOPAC will continue to have that role and work with the London Safeguarding Executive Working Group and the London Safeguarding Board. And that's an important role for MOPAC that we will continue to undertake, because the needs of the child is absolutely around safeguarding when it comes down to it in that area. So
lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. And now we're moving on to our last section, which is delivering and monitoring the police and crime plan, and it's starting off with Assembly Member Russell, please.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, so this is about monitoring progress, and the plan actually, there's a statement that says that MOPAC will use a mixture of quantitative and qualitative measures to present a picture of crime, safety and confidence in policing in London and monitor delivery. And it also says it's avoiding numerical targets and measures that are liable to change in the way they're recorded, which may create perverse incentives. So I just wonder if you could just tell us what new crime data and dashboards will be published to demonstrate how you're delivering against the police and crime plan.
So all I can tell you is that we are developing them at the moment. I can't tell you exactly what form they're going to take, but if you look at the two schematics which are within the actual draft plan, that would be roughly the structure that we would look to follow, and the one at the very end of the plan gives you the specific measures that we'd look to take. I think what we would look to do is provide trend data, because of the difficulty of choosing when should actually be the starting point, because as I said at the start, for some crimes maybe it's pre-COVID, like it will have a positive impact in crime and it will reduce. For others it might have a negative. So I think we would want to show some historical trend data for that, and then I think we would want to be able to provide some analysis alongside that, which comes from not just the assurance of the outcome, but the assurance of the process which got you there. Because sometimes obviously you can get brilliant outcomes but have had a terrible process, and other times you could have had a brilliant process and just because of the complexity of what's going on you'll still not have as good outcomes. So that's broadly how we'll be looking to do it. We would hope to be able to launch them before we put the first figures up, which will be the middle part of next year.
Thank you. Sophie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Not really. It is work in progress. And I think we have, one of the key elements of this police and crime plan and the previous one as well is how are we transparent and accountable. So those dashboards that MOPAC have, I think they are incredibly useful, rich in data. We've got to make sure that we have similar dashboards for showing progress on this police and crime plan as well.
Thank you. Yes, and certainly the dashboards are incredibly helpful, and particularly for tracking any disproportionality or, it's just they're a really important tool. So all the data you can give us is really appreciated. My next question is about the public attitude survey for Londoners, and there's not much information shared yet about how MOPAC is going to develop the additional questions, and also, how we're going to be assured that they're robust questions. So I just wonder if you can say anything about, what you're going to be doing with the public attitude survey, and in terms of taking that forward.
So, 3 elements to that. First of all is that in order to be able to get a more granular data, especially down to borough and sort of ward, but not necessarily neighbourhood level, we are intending to increase the size of the survey by roughly sort of 50%, which will actually give us a much firmer and more robust evidence base. The second thing is that we are looking to be the first people in the country as sort of genuine PCC to have this survey which really looks in detail at victimisation, so in the same way that CSCW does, and that will take out, because for example some of the crimes like hate crime we know are massively underreported. In fact, all crimes, especially rape and serious sexual offences and other offences, and this should give us a much better picture of what's happening at that. How are we making sure, given it is quite innovative, that this is effective? Well, our Equalities and Insights team are speaking with people such as the ONS, who are very supportive of this, to try and make sure that we are being as robust as possible. Inevitably, given this is the first time we're doing it, we will learn as we go. We will make sure that we have the feedback and that we are able to take that in. It takes a year from when you start doing a victimisation survey for you to be able to actually have comparable data, because you have to account for seasonality in the figures. But we're doing all of that. And then the final point which I would make is around, and this goes back to trust and confidence and what does local mean, which was one of the questions earlier. We are looking to work with the Met to look at hyper-local surveys where you maybe get down to really, really local level in areas where there may be high crime and lower trust and confidence, and really get under the skin of actually what is going on there. What's happening in those maybe 3, 4, 5, whatever sort of street or in particular estates around there, and use that evidence both for ourselves, for the Met, and hopefully for other statutory partners as well, to actually drive the right interventions. Because what's the right intervention in one bit of Lambeth, so I'm using Lambeth because that's where I live, may not be the right intervention for another bit of it. So having that sort of hyper locality will be really helpful in that context, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. A nice quick one for you, Sophie. Why has the Met's revised estate strategy not been published, and when will this delay be rectified?
I've got the same answer as last week, Susan and Caroline. It's come over to me in its final form. Clearly, you've got to go through it, and it did come over before where I had some challenges. It will be rectified soon. We will publish it as soon as it's ready to be published, when we've got real confidence as to what is in it, because this is an important piece of information for Londoners, is as accurate as possible.
It is important information, and it's eagerly awaited, and I'm afraid we will continue to ask you because we need to see it.
Of course you should, and so you should.
Okay. How much will the police and crime plan cost, and how will the Mayor pay for it?
I mean, the police and crime plan is based on priorities and outcomes, what will flow from the police and crime plan, depending on budgets, both mayoral budgets, and DLA budgets, and also government budgets. We will invest in the programmes on a sliding scale of the money and the investment that we can do. We're really clear what the priorities are. We're clear what the outcomes are. The budgets we will, when we know our budgets, we will be able to make decisions around that.
Okay, fine. And we've got two quick questions. Firstly, from Assembly Member Garrett. You've done yours earlier. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you very much, Chair. Sophie, I'm told firstly that you were going to sell Notting Hill Police Station to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Now I'm told you're not going to. Do you want to tell me why, or do you want to write to me on that, please?
No decision's been taken. My understanding is it was, well, not my understanding, it was designated as a community asset. If I can't remember, value of community asset. I've got it the wrong way around, but you know what I'm saying. And that runs out in January, so no decision has been taken as to who we sell that to, because it is not yet out to be sold. So I don't know where that information has come from, because it's certainly not something that's come across my desk. I've been really clear that the 6 months period to give communities and the borough the opportunity to, get themselves together if they want to buy it has not yet run out. So no decision has been taken.
That's very interesting, thank you. And Louisa, just a very quick one, please. We had aggressive anti-vaxxers outside Chelsea COVID Centre yesterday. Would you be able to write to us and tell us what are the levels of prosecutions for these very aggressive anti-vaxxer actions across London, please? Don't expect an answer now.
Yes, of course.
Lovely. Okay, thank you very much. Well done, colleagues. We've got done in a timely way. Assistant Commissioner, I'm sorry you haven't been asked so much, but it's mainly on the crime plan, which we accept is in the hands of MOPAC. Anyway, I would like to thank our guests for attending this morning and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report, the discussion, and the monthly report received from MOPAC? Can I also ask that we delegate authority to me as Deputy Chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Thank you very much. Can I ask the committee to note the work programme? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 6th of January 2022 at 10 a.m. So I will therefore wish everybody a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year. I have no any other urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.